Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. I'm Emily Jones. I'm an associate professor here at the school, and it gives me great pleasure to see so many people turn out tonight. All our four candidates and Rob Watson, who will moderate for us tonight, who's the BBC's political correspondent for the World Service and BBC World TV. And just to say one thing, which is that trust in our political institutions, in our government, is at an all-time low. And we firmly believe here at the school that us engaging as citizens with our to-be elected representatives is a really important part of our democracy and rebuilding the institutions that are so fundamental to us as a country. So just to say thank you for coming, to being with us, and thank you to Rob, who will introduce our speakers, for moderating tonight. So thank you all.
Right, I better put this down then, hadn't I? Right, well, thanks to you all for coming and to the candidates for being ready to take your questions. This is very much your evening. I mean by that you, the voters, and of course you, the candidates. As the Dimblebiz jobs on radio and TV have already been taken by other BBC colleagues, I won't be trying to use this evening to oust them. I should say that I am a local man. Indeed, it would be hard to get more local. In fact, I was born on this very spot. And in fact, the person who gave birth to me is in the audience, pretty much on this spot that used to be the Radcliffe Infirmary. I think that's probably as much detail as you need to know. I returned to Oxford with my family in 2005 to raise another generation of Oxonians. Anyway, before getting to the candidates and giving them a 3-minute opening slot, I thought I'd just remind everyone, if that's okay with you guys, about how close the result was last time. So Lena Moran had 43.7% of the vote, the Conservative candidate 42.4%, the Labour candidate 12.6%, and the UKIP party 1.3%. So this is very much a marginal constituency, so every vote counts. We thought that perhaps the best way to organise the evening would be by having chunks of time on broad subjects of, say, I think they're really surprising, right? Brexit, nobody thought that might come up. The economy, public services, local Oxfordshire issues, and as Emily was saying, that the whole issue of trust in politics. But first of all, let's hear from the candidates, and I think it's going to be 3 minutes each. Did you agree? Did you agree on order back there?
No.
Is what? That can certainly come in. Don't worry, it'll be included. Yes. I think they can stand when they talk. I don't think anyone's got a problem with that. Yes, absolutely. Right. So did you agree on how you were going to do this? Alphabetically. Right. So, yes, that's you, James.
Fantastic.
So you better introduce yourself first.
There we go. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, the mics are working. Excellent. So I'm James Fredrickson. I'm the Conservative candidate in this election. Now, my path into politics certainly wasn't Brexit. My background is in digital technology. So I started my career at Vodafone down the road in Newbury, and now I work in the Abingdon Business Park for a company called GigaClear. We roll out fibre optic infrastructure in rural areas. And that element of my background, a real interest in connectivity, how it can empower people, how it can improve people's lives, is how I got involved in politics. I had a relative who was in a care home in Newbury, and when I actually went to meet some of the people who were looking after them and seeing how our care systems were working, I saw that they just weren't utilizing any critical infrastructure. They weren't utilizing the connectivity opportunities to give our carers more time when they were visiting people who are out and about. Some of our carers were literally spending 40 minutes driving from case to case, and 10 minutes when they were visiting someone actually in their home. With a little bit of connectivity and a little bit of a technology improving some of those services, we managed to increase that visit time to 45 minutes rather than 10 minutes, and it made a huge benefit to the residents who were being visited. And the MP at the time, Nicola Blackwood, asked me to get involved in politics after I introduced her to some of those trials that we were doing. And that's how I ended up getting involved in politics. Of course, Brexit is going to dominate this election, as much as many of us, I would imagine, wouldn't want that to be the case. I was an absolute adamant Remainer. I didn't just vote for Remain, I campaigned for Remain. And I was utterly heartbroken when I saw that we did not win that particular referendum. For a long time, I thought a second referendum would actually be quite a powerful solution, that when a deal was presented, it could go to the country again. But After the first referendum result, I carried on canvassing in the areas that voted leave in the constituency, particularly South Abingdon, areas of Kidlington, and the appetite for a second referendum completely fell away when Joe Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, said, actually, even if there was a second referendum and the result was to leave the EU, we still would not accept it. We're the party of Remain. If you are a Leave voter and you hear that, it feels like the entire Liberal democratic process has been cut out underneath you. We are 4 candidates here on the stage tonight, and we are privileged that politics to us is about going out and engaging with so many of you. But I am so very aware that for the vast majority of people, the only true engagement they have to have their politicians be accountable to them is that cross in the box. And I think now, given what has been said about how some parties would respect a second referendum, given that the result was leave, my position is that results should be respected. As much as it wasn't what I voted for, it's not just Brexit at stake in this referendum. It's not just whether we're in and out of the EU. It's the essence of liberal democracy. And there is a party of that name that I fundamentally think has lost its way. And I very much remember the words of Paddy Ashdown when he said, "Woe betide any party that stands in the way of what the answer of this referendum is." Now, I'm sure there'll be many questions on any other topics. I'm really, really looking forward to talking to you tonight. But I'll stop it there because I'm conscious of time. But a pleasure to meet you all. Really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And that was pretty impressive. That was bang on 3 minutes. You might consider a career in radio journalism, but we'll continue that discussion another time. Lena Moran.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Blavatnik School for holding this standing room only hustings. It has been, honestly, the privilege of my life to be your MP. When I was elected, frankly by shock, slightly, overturning a nearly 10,000 Conservative majority in this constituency that voted Remain in 2017, and winning by just 816 precious votes. And I am very much hoping that tonight I will convince you to want to re-elect me. Now, of course, this election is caused by Brexit. I have never wanted to leave the European Union. Our party is standing on a platform of stop Brexit by any democratic means. But in order to tackle the big issues that are facing not just our country in terms of public services, I'm education spokesperson for the party, school funding, the NHS, but also the world's issues, and I think in particular of climate change. We are facing, I think, what is a crossroads in our country's future, one that doesn't just determine our economic future, but actually the reason why I'm an internationalist is because I believe in that European peace project. The project that was conceived in the aftermath of much conflict, certainly on this continent, and has proved that by trading with other countries, that's how you achieve peace. And I think that has not been spoken about anywhere near enough. It certainly wasn't during the referendum. But this is our chance in our parliamentary democracy to decide that future. And I don't believe that that future is safe in Boris Johnson's hands. This is a man who we know has perhaps, when we're putting it, a casual relationship with the truth. But certainly the time that we found, I think, most disturbing was when he, in fact, lied to the Queen during that prorogation and had to be hauled up by the courts in order to allow Parliament to do its job. And as your MP, I believe that that is what I need to do, is to stand up for what Oxford, West and Abingdon wants. But that also, of course, extends not just to the big national issues, but also to the local ones. I promised at the last election that I would open an office. That's exactly what I've done. We've dealt with 20,000 pieces of casework. Some of, I'm sure, have come from you and our policy inquiries, but some are far more delicate than that. People who are facing issues with their benefits, single mothers who need somewhere so that they can live so they don't become homeless, families whose children have special needs who need my help in order to get it. There is so much injustice in the world, and I've put the residents of Oxford, West and Abingdon front and centre. Even the pushes that I've made on climate change have been inspired by our children. I stood there in a protest of our children in Bond Square, and they asked me to go and work on climate change and I went back, called the first debate on the main floor of the House in 2.5 years, worked with Caroline Lucas to bring Greta Thunberg to speak to other parliamentarians, and I believe now that climate change has become one of the top issues of this election. So I'll simply say thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Good. Sorry to interrupt that last bit.
Oh, I was... Forgive me.
Now, we were doing this alphabetical order, yeah, so Rosie, if you introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, I'm Rosie Sourbut and I'm standing to be your Labour MP for Oxford West and Abingdon. I decided to stand for Parliament after spending this summer researching the association between universal credit and food poverty at Oxford's Department of Social Policy, and I spent a large part of the summer volunteering in food banks in Oxford and talking to the volunteers there as well as the people using them. And I met people in really desperate circumstances that were completely unnecessary and were a direct result of cruel changes to the benefits system, of the cruel waiting time to get universal credit, of sanctions, of cuts to disability benefits and delays in people not receiving their disability benefits. I met a disabled man who had £13 left a month to live on after paying his rent and his bills. I met hungry children. There was a very powerful documentary on Channel 4 the other night about some of those children that you may have seen. And there's children in that situation in Oxford West and Abingdon as well. So that's kind of what inspired me to stand for Parliament, because I wanted to do everything I could to ensure that we don't get more of the same. We don't get more of what we've had for the last decade of Tory Lib Dem austerity, making life harder for the vast majority of people in this country and disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable people, disproportionately affecting women, disproportionately affecting people from ethnic minorities and people with disabilities. The other reason why I decided to stand and why I'm really proud to be standing in this constituency is because of the environmental crisis. And Labour is the only party standing in this constituency with an adequate plan to solve the environmental crisis. We're going to decarbonise by the 2030s, earlier if possible, and we're going to aim to achieve that by investing 3% of GDP a year in research and development, working towards those green technologies that are going to aid us in bringing about a green industrial revolution. The Tories and Lib Dems are only promising to decarbonise by 2045. That's far too late for our planet. Labour's plan will allow us to create 1 million new green, clean jobs in the technologies we need, building 9,000 new wind power generators, building 22,000 football pitches worth of solar panels, and ensuring that we make that transition towards green public transport. We're also going to invest properly in public services. We're going to tackle the shortage of 100,000 staff, 43,000 nurses that we currently have in the NHS. So at this election, we've got a really stark choice. We've got a Boris Johnson-led Conservative government pushing for a hard Brexit that will erode workers' rights, that will harm our economy, that will strip back environmental protections and put us in danger of a really damaging trade deal with the US. We've got the choice of Boris Johnson, who's repeatedly lied at every stage in his professional career, said incredibly offensive things about probably the vast majority of people in this audience during his journalistic career. And then we've got the choice of a Labour government working for the many, investing in our public services, ending austerity, ensuring we have that safety net back in society, and that we're working towards a green future while improving the quality of life for everyone. So I really hope that you'll vote Labour. We've got a choice. It can be better than it's been for the last decade.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosie. You had the great fortune to be sitting next door to the stopwatch, but still managed to go a tiny bit over. Allison, the floor is yours. If you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Allison Wilde. It's great to be back here again. Oxford is very close to my heart. I graduated with a Master of Science in Clinical Pharmacology, I don't know, a few years ago. And it's lovely to see some friendly, familiar faces in the audience. Thank you for coming tonight. I decided to stand for the Brexit Party after the results of the referendum were completely ignored. My background is my parents met in London. They emigrated to Canada, and I grew up half in Canada and half on my grandparents' farm in Somerset. And then I got a scholarship to Brown University in the United States, and upon graduation I moved back to the farm in Somerset to look after my grandfather before he passed away. Then I moved to London, and 30 years ago I moved to the area. I have a local company, it's biosciences. We specialize in EU cosmetic regulations, and our clients are all over the world. I'm a specialist in the EU regulations for the skincare industry. So I firsthand in that industry how the EU has affected, these regulations have affected growth and our economy and our industry in that one area. But I decided to stand and put my head above the parapet when I saw democracy being denied and the vast majority of, really the silent majority, their voice not being listened to. And above all, whether you do or did vote leave or you voted remain, your vote is as important as anybody else's. And one thing in our precious democracy is losers' consent. The losers must consent when the majority has won. I see someone shaking their head. No, that is just like Nicola consented when Layla won by a mere 800 votes. Nicola didn't say, oh, you didn't know what you were voting for with the Lib Dems because they said they would honor their manifesto in 2017, and I don't think they're going to honor it. And indeed, maybe Nicola was right. 800 votes, that was all, but we, the vast majority of voters in this country, won by 1.6 million votes. And we have many policies in addition to upholding democracy, which is the fundamental problem. It's much more important than Brexit. Brexit is ultimately important, and Parliament has caused a deadlock in our society for the last 3.5 years. The problem wasn't Brexit. The problem is listening to the people. So we are investing in the NHS. We're saving 100 billion pounds by cancelling HS2. We are training our own doctors and nurses, giving the nurses the bursary. We have investment in local infrastructure that will benefit cities around the country, and especially Oxford, where we all know how difficult it is to get around and the congestion here in our city. So,
Allison, can you wrap it up, yeah?
Oh.
Go on. No, carry on, finish your sentence.
Okay. Anyway, I'm very pleased and honoured to be standing for you in this constituency.
Well, thanks to all the candidates for their opening remarks. Can I make a brief plea, which is for everyone to, I mean, I know this sounds like I've been in California for too long, but could everyone just really please be nice, and nice to each other, and nice to the candidates, because I think we can do without any absolute grief. We really can. It's just not needed. I just wanted to do something for my own behalf before we get started. How many people, a quick show of hands, how many people have already made up their minds how to vote? Right, so, well, actually, I would say that's still a lot to play for. Right, now, as I mentioned, we're going to do this in chunks of subjects, so we'll do Brexit first. I mean, if I said, has anybody got a question about Brexit, might a hand appear, possibly? My goodness. Not, yes. Yes. Oh, hang on one second, I've forgotten about a microphone, of course.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask each of the candidates what benefits their policy on Brexit would bring to the constituency of Oxford, West and Abingdon.
Right, well, should we do this in, why don't we just, this time round we'll go this way and then next time we'll go that way. I mean, that's as good a way as any, right? Allison.
So what Brexit will bring, local infrastructure benefits. We save 39 billion pounds, probably more like 65 billion immediately. And we, pardon? Okay, especially Oxford and especially medicine, you probably don't realize, but when we joined the EU, we were the leader in clinical trials in the world. When we joined, 2/3 of clinical trials went to other countries. Right now, the University of Oxford is, for the 4th year in a row, the #1 university in the world, according to the Times Higher Education ranking list. #1. We have the best universities in the world, obviously with Oxford, Cambridge, and Imperial. And the EU doesn't even have any other university in the top 40. Why are we losing our clinical trials? We bring this back. We bring the trials back where they were. We have the best medical school in the world here, the very best medical school.
I suppose you could make the argument, couldn't you, that actually Britain had the best universities while it was a member of the EU. I mean, it's not
but
like
we
EU
had the
membership.
best before, didn't we?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying. Anyway,
But then,
carry on.
but then why haven't the EU universities in Germany or in France have caught up? They're not even close.
I think we'll have to have a different evening to tackle education.
So we'll bring that's one benefit to Oxford, bring clinical trials back, then that will bring jobs for medical researchers. It's not always about GPs. GPs and clinicians rely on our medical researchers, and we need to bring the clinical trials back to the best university in the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Rosie, why don't you have a crack at that one?
Yeah.
I mean, do you want people to stand up? Is that better?
Yeah,
Okay.
they want. Yeah, so what benefits will our Brexit policy bring to Oxford, West and Abingdon? Well, firstly, we're going to resolve the Brexit question within 6 months. I campaigned to remain in 2016, and as your MP, I'll do that again. But I think just revoking the referendum result without a second referendum wouldn't settle the question. What we need is to put a solid Brexit deal that's one that protects workers' rights, protects the economy, protects our environment, protects peace in Northern Ireland. We put that to the people alongside the option to remain, and then we can move forwards and we won't have to be using all of our political energy and the sort of stalemate that we've had for the past 3 years and the stagnation on any improvement in social policy or environmental policy or any of the kind of other issues we're facing. But the kind of benefits of staying in the EU, well, there'll be massive benefits to Oxford, West and Abingdon. We've got so much science and technology and research going on here, which relies a lot on grants from the European Union, on collaboration with researchers and scientists from other European Union countries. Also, just in terms of, the kind of positive result for our economy, which we'll have throughout the constituency, I think, we'll have an end to the sort of...
But I'm sorry,
yeah.
if I could interrupt. I mean, I'm curious about one thing. I mean, I think we have to be careful not to refight the Brexit referendum, and not, of course, unless, of course, there's a second one, in which case we'll certainly be doing it. But I mean, what is the message to people who voted leave from Remainers? I mean, what would the argument be if there's a second referendum, briefly?
I think the first referendum that was called by David Cameron should never have been called on the terms it was called on, because it just wrote a blank cheque for the government, whatever government was in power, to negotiate whatever type of Brexit deal or no deal that they wanted to. And actually, in order to kind of properly discuss the European Union membership question, what we should have is a certain deal that's the best deal we can get, that's one that's not going to kind of tip us into catastrophe like Boris Johnson's will, and put that to people alongside Remain. And that's, if we were going to have a European referendum in 2016, that's what we should have done the first time around, and that's what we should do this time, is have a certain thing so people have a clear option of what they're voting for.
Thank you, Rosie. James. I mean, I was wondering, before you get to answer the question, whether you didn't feel somewhat uncomfortable as someone who'd campaigned to Remain, to be in now such an out-and-out pro-Brexit party. But anyway, you better deal with that one and the one that you were asked.
Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have been involved in an argument over Brexit in the last 3 years? Yeah. I live in a little village outside of Abingdon called Radley, and I live on a little close, and it's quite literally somewhere where everyone will kind of take each other's bins out, everyone knows everybody sort of thing. And you go through, you touch on the comment of Brexit, and suddenly someone's not going to be taking out your bins. But I'm not going to go and talk to that person because they voted that way. I'm not going to talk to them because they did this. And whilst that's very parochial in the example I've given there, the question is the benefit. And I think the benefit is in that sense of respecting. If there is a majority that anywhere, and I think across the country, the sense of respecting the result, as much as I fully appreciate there have been plenty in here who do feel very frustrated by that opinion, I do believe that is where a majority now sits within the country. And I say this as someone who adamantly campaigned for Remain, and someone that actually thought for a long time a second referendum would be an effective means of actually saying, okay, whatever the deal negotiated, whether it's Labour's deal, whether it's Conservatives' deal, whatever deal you eventually arrive at through the Article 50 process, putting that to the people, again, for a long time I thought that would be an effective solution. But we're quite literally in a position now where a party that literally campaigned for a people's vote said that, oh, if we were successful in securing a mandate to have that second referendum, if the result was then still to leave, their MPs would not accept it. Now, I fully appreciate I'm in the middle of Oxford. This is absolutely true. Please Google it. This is Jo Swinson's position that she said when she was interviewed by Andrew Marr. Now, if that is the position and you voted to leave, and I fully appreciate that that is not going to be the majority in this particular room tonight, given where we are, I fully accept that. But put yourself in that position, to hear someone say, okay, you voted that way the first time, we're going to ask you to vote again. And even then, if that is your position, that they wouldn't accept it. That's not liberal democracy. That's not genuine democracy. The actual solution, the benefit, I think, is to get to a position where we can, and I believe that it is there, come to a position where we respect the result, we move forwards, have a deal, have a transition period, negotiate a free trade agreement. There are so many more important things than Brexit. We talked about the climate emergency as one that I hope we'll come on to tonight. That is where our political emphasis, those kind of things, and an aging population, Brexit has sucked energy out of that. I would very much like to see the result respected as much as it wasn't how I voted. My vote shouldn't count for more than my peers. I live in a liberal democratic world and I want to protect that as best we can. And if respecting the result, respecting liberal democracy is the answer to that.
Okay, James.
Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone has been keeping their answers admirably short. So, Layla, you've got that tricky question has been raised. Was it a mistake by your party to sort of go straight from revoke to straight from asking for, instead of asking for a second referendum, revoke? But
right.
anyway, you have the question.
Thank you. And I will answer James's challenge head on, actually. What Jo Swinson actually said was that as Liberal Democrats, we would never stop making the case for our internationalist, open, tolerant values. And in this election, there is a choice. This is a democratic event where everyone has a vote. And let's face it, if the Lib Dems went from 20 seats to 326 seats at least, we would take that as a mandate, because that would be a seismic shift in what would happen in British politics. But also, we are pragmatic, and let's face it, that doesn't look like that's what's going to happen, sadly. And so we are back to Plan A. I helped to launch the People's Vote. It was with Chuka Ramuna and Anna Soubry and Caroline Lucas. I think it is interesting that Anna Soubry and Chuka Ramuna are now no longer members of their parties. That's what's happened, I think, to very many voters who feel that they are not represented anymore by the Labour Party, which I'm delighted, given that Jeremy Corbyn has been a Eurosceptic for much of his career, has come kicking and screaming to this position. Great. I wish he'd got there earlier, because frankly, I think we would have had our people's vote by now had he done that. And then you've got Boris Johnson. And I've already, I think, said quite enough about Boris Johnson. But to answer the question, the original question, I get asked this a lot. What benefits would Brexit bring? None. None. Look at our community.
Right.
And look at our community. You know, this diverse community of academics. And we know, probably if you work in the university, you know a personal story of an EU citizen who has either thought about coming to work either on a project or come and move here or were here, but decided that their future lay elsewhere. By stopping Brexit, we would stop that exodus. Those very same EU citizens, by the way, prop up our NHS and our social care. And it is utterly, utterly unacceptable that when we have so many local jobs, not just the science sector, but I remind us that we have BMW right on our doorstep, who have been vocal recently about the prospect of no deal. And I will draw your attention to Boris Johnson today at the press conference at that NATO summit, when he was asked directly several times, is no deal off the table? And he can't and won't answer the question, because the answer is no deal is still on the table and would have greatly damaging consequences for our economy. So we need to just stop Brexit.
Thank you, Layla. I mean, this would be utterly unscientific. I mean, as James pointed out, it's probably not a typical demographic when it comes to the Brexit issue. But on a show of hands, I mean, who would want there to be a second referendum? Right, as I said, probably not an entirely typical demographic. So we've already had 11 minutes and 16 seconds on Brexit. So has anyone got, we could maybe have one other question on Brexit, but it needs to be different to the one we've already had. Yes, lady there. And you know, quick question, yeah? So as we can...
Okay, this question is a build on the previous one, and it's a subject very close to my heart. We always talk, and Priti Patel is very delighted to tell us that there will be no freedom of movement for EU citizens coming to the UK. What they never, ever tell us is that British citizens will lose their freedom of movement to live, work, study, and love in Europe. What are the benefits of stopping British citizens doing that?
Well, I mean, I suppose, I think obviously I'll restrict that question to those on the panel who are in favour of Brexit. So why don't you have a crack at that one, Allison?
It goes hand in hand. If we welcome people from around the world, then we give up the freedom of movement to increase our population by 500,000 people every year. We can't sustain that anymore. But yes, we can go and travel and work in Europe. Yes, we can. I did, my husband did, well before we joined the EU. Yes, we can. We have a visa. So we're going to open our borders because we can't be bothered to fill in a little visa form. I mean, and we're going to give up on democracy because we can't. No, that doesn't make sense at all. Of course, when we go to the United States, when we go to Canada, we fill in a visa form. We don't get banned from traveling there. We don't even get banned from working there. Yes, it is the immigration policy. Anybody who wants to come here can come with a work permit. That is absolutely the policy. But we limit permanent settlement to $50,000 a year, which is where it was before Tony Blair came into power in 1997. Yes, we have immigration. We need immigration. I'm an immigrant. My husband's an immigrant. Yes, we value immigration, but it cannot continue uncontrolled and affect our schools, our hospitals, our GP surgeries like it is. We're all suffering from uncontrolled immigration.
Allison, thanks very much. I think I checked it up on one of these reality check things that the BBC seems to think that its future lies in. And I think the Brexit Party has promised to reduce annual immigration, but has not put a figure on it, which I suppose, given what's happened to previous governments and figures, you could sort of understand why.
It is on our, it's on the website, it's on the policy.
Yeah, but it says to reduce it. I don't think there's a figure as such, Allison. But anyway, James.
As someone who voted and campaigned to remain, literally, where did it go wrong? No, that's an I'll try and build that into the answer. Sorry, so everyone who didn't hear that, someone said, oh, well, you find yourself in the wrong party. I firmly believe that I do not. I was so very conscious of the promise that I made when I was knocking on those doors, which I would respect it, and so therefore I do not. In regards to the question, the benefits of the single market, I think, are fantastic. It was one of the reasons why, a particular point that I made on the doorstep, my fiancé is an immigrant. The opportunities that have been enabled through being a member of the single market have dramatically made my life better in that respect. But at the same time, I completely understand that this was put forward to people as part of the debate. And this was a debate that, very sadly, I lost.
But I guess the question, I think the questioner's point, though, James, is, I suppose it's not so much a question, it's a sort of a gripe that people who are talking about restricting immigration, freedom of movement, have to accept that it goes the other way.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The comment is, it's not a gripe, that it's actually more fundamental. I'll repeat back.
British people are told not to apply. all right? It's not as simple as just get a work permit, because British citizens will go to the back of the queue as a third country, and they will have to go to the back of the queue behind, rightly, all EEA citizens. So when, before the referendum, I spoke to, happily not for me, Douglas Carswell, Peter Lilly, who said, oh, don't be silly little girl. Of course your British people will be able to work freely, because the British are wonderful and British are allowed to do everything they want, which is what you've just said. It's not true. So British people are going to be stopped from working unless they're very experienced. So for younger generation people, it's pretty much shutting the door. And that is why I want you to tell me what the benefit is, particularly to the younger generation. My 22-year-old son, who's at Oxford, what benefits it to him he can no longer apply for a job in Germany, having studied for 5 years German? That's what I'm asking.
Yes, you can.
So my answer to that is, one, they can still apply. But I completely get the frustration in the sense of it's very different in comparison to being in the single market and not. I'm not going to trivialize that. I completely get that frustration. Bear in mind, I'm here as someone who ultimately respects the result and wants to take us out of the European Union. In the manner of doing that, I want a free trade agreement that will be negotiated to factor in these things. Just because we're leaving the European Union, in my view, doesn't mean that we should be turning it and burning bridges. These are our allies. These are our friends. Our collaborations should be not just in the sense of study or research and development. It should also be in security. It should also be in protection of our liberal democratic rights in regards to our foreign policy, our place in NATO, for example. So my answer to it is, the benefit of respecting liberal democracy, which I know is a frustration from when you're hearing it here, but in that sense of what comes with the free trade agreement, if we're leaving the EU, do it with a deal. We do not need to turn our back to Europe, so that some of the benefits you described, although I completely accept they will be different with us out of the single market, we can still benefit from them through what we negotiate with that free trade agreement.
Right, thanks, James. So we've already done 18 minutes on Brexit, and I mean, if we can, we could always come back to it. Let's see how things go. But if we move on to the economy, and again, if people make their sort of questions as short as possible and without having statements as such. Now, we haven't actually had a yes, sir. Peter.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's a small city. We play tennis together, so interest declared. I have no idea what his political views are. We only discuss forehand and backhand.
Well, you're about to find out.
Right. Are you sure you want to ask a question? No, I was just kidding. On the economy, Peter. Yeah?
On the economy, it's clear that all the parties are now sort of going out of their way to spend as much money as they can, on the grounds that somehow, suddenly, austerity is over. Can we focus back on is it 10 years of austerity that we've gone through? Can I ask each of the candidates whether they think, A, there was any economic rationale for that at all? Then what was it? Or have we literally just have had 10 wasted years that could have seen both our social services and our economy in a much stronger position?
Right. Thank you, Peter. Still don't really know your politics, but I think I can guess, maybe, yeah? Layla, would you want to take that one first?
Sure. So, looking back over the last 10 years, I mean, we see the results now. We absolutely need to be spending. All the parties are doing it, some more than others. And I would also point people to independent assessments of not just how much we're going to spend, but also how we're going to pay for that spend. And the IFS has had a sort of health check of all the economic policies of the different parties. And I'm pleased to say we've come out well as Liberal Democrats, but I will also point out that both the Labour and the Conservative Party manifesto commitments do not add up. To the question specifically, though, was there an economic rationale? My understanding was yes. All three parties in that 2010 election stood on platforms of various types of austerity. And that is, just look back, something in the order of, between 84 and 80 billion in terms of a contraction. And the same goes for the Labour Party. Where I think there were mistakes made is, I think, and Jo has put her hands up, and I was I have to tell you, I was a very uncomfortable Lib Dem during coalition. As many of you know, I was elected after it. I nearly left the party over things like tuition fees. I'm no fan of the Health and Social Care Act. And on the bedroom tax, for example, that was just a tragic mistake, and it really was a mistake, and Joe has said that. But in 2015, we then saw what the Conservatives do when they weren't tethered by the Liberal Democrats. And what did they do? In universal credit, for example, they introduced a cruel policy of a two-child limit to new claimants. You know, this is a party that just doesn't get what it means to live on the breadline. And in that 2015 Liberal Democrat manifesto, we were talking about releasing some of that money back to grow those public services. In this election, what we have said is twofold. First of all, we do need to spend on our schools. 80% of schools in Oxford, West and Abingdon that are state-funded are going to see cuts next year. We would bring that money back to the 2015 spend immediately next year, and over the course of the next 5 years, overshoot where they were able to spend since 2010. On the NHS, we need to find money for the NHS, but actually we've been clear about where that money should come from. And it's a penny on the pound on income tax, ring-fenced for the NHS and social care, because there's a balance to be struck between how much you borrow to spend in capital infrastructure, which we will also do, and modest tax rises so that you can pay. So I think I'm going to guess the premise of where you come from. We absolutely need to be spending, but we also need to get that balance right so that we don't end up back to square one, where you didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining. And should there be any other economic shock that is globally triggered, that we have the resilience as a country to be able to weather that.
Layla, thank you very much. Obviously, this is a big issue, so I'll let everyone go slightly long, but if everyone could focus on keeping it tight. James, I guess you're being asked to defend 10 years of austerity.
In the sense of the rationale, the first part of your question, I agree that I think that some of the comments Layla has made in the sense of there was a rationale where the country found itself in regards to its finances, it dramatically saw a contraction in regards to its growth forecasts and a heavy recession. We were in a position where extremely tough decisions had to be made. And so I think in the sense of seeing debt as a proportion of GDP go up to the scale that it did, but we're now at the point in the last year where we now see debt as a proportion of GDP falling. And I understand that your views on this will come down to the view that you have in the sense of how your economy should function, whether you're a socialist, whether you're a capitalist, something in the middle, free marketeer. There's a huge debate sitting underneath this. But from my perspective, any kind of borrowing, you are borrowing from a future generation. It has to be paid back at some point. The interest that you pay on that is dependent on your government and how it structures its bonds. But in a high level, I think, in response to your first question, there was a rationale. Where we see ourselves now, I think lessons certainly have to be learnt in the sense of, okay, if you accept that debt as a proportion of GDP is now falling and you can spend more, and I'm glad to see each party saying that we should be spending more, the way that shift happened was haphazard. So you've seen some industries where caps have been taken off earlier than others, which has created animosity. So in, say, police in comparison to, say, education, nursing in comparison to other industries, there's a frustration. There actually should have been a sense of, as we take this off, we should do that in a much more structured way. And I think that's a learning that this government should be taking forwards, other parties as well. But on a broader basis, if we accept that we can now take that break off a little bit and spend a bit more, it's only a little bit. I still am firmly of the belief that anything that you essentially borrow is still borrowing from a future generation. So there should be a sense of caution. To be fiscally conservative and cautious in regards to what your government is going to spend, I think is the pragmatic way we should approach this. So seeing some caution, for example, £1 that every time is spent in the Conservative manifesto, we have £28 being spent by the Labour Party. Now, honestly, how realistic is that? Would you actually want to see that level of spend? I think that is something that obviously you will have to be the judge of in the sense of the manifestos, but in the sense of that balance, I think it was justified. Lessons to be learned, absolutely, but a sense of caution still, I think, is the right approach.
James, thank you. And being a bit of a nerd on this one, I thought this might come up, so I had the figures in front of me. The budget deficit when the Conservatives came to power was 9.3% of GDP. That's how much the government was having to borrow, 9.3% of the nation's wealth in order to pay its way. The budget deficit is now at 1.5%. So seeing as I know that the Labour Party, that you're against austerity, I thought I'd do things a perhaps slightly different way, because I mean, there's no, okay. I mean, I'm sure you can condemn austerity, but to actually look at what the spending plans are now for day-to-day spending. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I've got it that Conservatives want to have increased the spending on day-to-day services by 23-24 to £37 billion. For Labour, it's 107 billion. The Liberal Democrats, 67. You're going to have to forgive me if I don't have a figure for the Brexit Party, Allison. So I guess the question is, you're comfortable with that figure, and you're not worried about people thinking, where on earth is that going to come from? Because the IFS, which has been quoted, doesn't think that your tax rises that have been mentioned would do it. The floor is yours.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely comfortable with that figure, and austerity was a political choice. It was ideologically motivated, it was cruel, and it harmed our economy, and it did that while killing 120,000 to 130,000 people who wouldn't have died if it wasn't for austerity policies. Yes, that's more than a constituency of people whose voices can't be heard in this election because they're not alive anymore. And I do just urge you to think of those people when you cast your vote, and to think of the people who are still suffering from the consequences of austerity, from the cruel policies that have driven loads of people to homelessness, to despair, to having to rely on food banks, to a massive explosion in food poverty, in fuel poverty in our country. And it's unacceptable, and it wasn't necessary, and the Conservatives did it while cutting taxes for billionaires. They found the money to bribe the DUP into government with them. Yeah. It's a choice, and it was a cruel choice that hurt the most vulnerable in our society. And yeah, I really ask you to please think of those people when you cast your vote.
Allison, were you in favour of austerity? I mean, do you think that budget deficit should be?
Unfortunately, it was necessary. It was necessary because of how Labour overspent while they were in government.
Continue.
It's a global financial
what
crash,
you're
and
doing,
lots of countries spending more than us recovered much quicker than us.
What you're doing when you tax and spend, all you're doing is passing the debt on to your children. Is that fair? No. It's like buying a car and making them pay the loan while they're trying to pay their own school fees and this and that. It's absolutely fiscally irresponsible.
Our children are hungry at the moment. The cost of not acting is much higher.
Our children aren't hungry, actually. No, our children aren't hungry. There are some... What, in Oxfordshire? Come on.
Yes, I've met hungry children in Oxford.
Can I finish?
Can we just let's finish this point, yeah?
Our children who are hungry in Oxfordshire have help. We have help. We have Layla helping them. We have food. The Labour Party, what Layla has said is really important to her. She concentrates on that, while people who are more fiscally responsible ensure children across the country are taken care of, and children have school meals, and we pay for that, and we support that. That's the reality. Why on earth would you want your children to suffer? Because you don't want to suffer 2 more years of austerity. You want your children to suffer 20 years, because our national debt right now is £1.8 trillion. 1.8 trillion pounds. Do you know how much we spend servicing that debt? That is an awful burden to put on our children. Why do we choose that? Where there is no money, we have to be more fiscally responsible. The money doesn't grow on trees, and there are no forests of money. You can't just grab it here. When you borrow, you are borrowing from your children and from your grandchildren. Why would anyone make that choice? That is highly fiscally irresponsible.
Well, I think we can see that we have a very quick one, very quickly.
I mean, Allison, yes, I do. That's my focus for me in my office, is to help these children and these families. But I shouldn't have to. And those are the ones who find me and we reach out to. And I think this is where we need to accept that we are a G7 country, we should have no child who goes to school hungry. And I have visited those schools in our constituency, and those children exist. They absolutely exist, and it's heartbreaking. So to suggest that in Oxfordshire they have the help, actually, I think just shows that perhaps you haven't seen our community in the way that I have, and they absolutely need way more help than they're getting.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Can I ask everyone a brief question, which is, I mean, do we think, do we think that the problem in this country is that the cake isn't big enough, that we need to make the cake bigger? I'm sorry, I'm sounding like my colleague Evan Davis on Radio 4. Is it that the problem that the cake isn't big enough, or that the kind of the existing cake is okay, but we just need to be dividing it in a different way? A quick
Okay, very quickly.
from all of you.
So, to the size of the cake,
both,
I think you should always have more cake. And that's why we need to stop.
That reminds me of a certain person. And eat it.
Indeed.
My friend.
But this is why we want to stop Brexit. Because it is a fact that the economy will grow faster if we do not leave the European Union. So you grow the cake by not Brexiting. But to the point about how we spend it, I actually think I sit on the Public Accounts Committee. And one of my deep frustrations, when I used to be an MP, now a candidate, is how government departments actually don't look enough to the medium and the long-term consequences of policy changes. A good example of this, I think, we've seen locally. Children's centres are a very, very good way of starting to close the gap, particularly between the poorest and the richest families. And that money absolutely should have been ring-fenced, all through coalition. And actually in Oxfordshire, we maintained our children's centres until about 2016, when they went from something like 38 to now something like 6. And I think that's a massive, massive mistake. Meant that volunteers now need to run them, and we need to start spending on these key hubs of our communities, because they stop that longer-term deprivation, which actually costs a lot of money. And it's not just about, there is a public purse case for helping those people, as well as, frankly, it's just the right thing to do.
Thank you, Layla. Remember short, cake bigger or just dividing up the cake as it is. And that is an interesting point for you guys in the Conservative Party, isn't it? That you are advocating a policy in Brexit which even your own government's forecast suggests there's no version of it that won't be bad for the economy. I mean, that's the government's own figures. So yeah, the question about the cake.
In regards to the question about the cake, I think Rosie made a comment about a tax reduction in the sense of income tax, particularly for the highest earners. And yet, whilst you could say on face value, it's a bung to billionaires, actually the reduction meant that more money actually came into the Treasury. You actually had an increase. You gained more. You had more income. So I think in one answer to the question of the cake, I think trying to look at the cake in the sense of, well, actually, what is the most effective tax measure you can have, where even if you're reducing taxes, if it actually means you get more in, and that you can then more effectively spend in certain areas whilst you're not having that deadweight loss associated with taxation in regards to our wider economy, then do it. That is a practical solution. But in the sense of when I think about the size of the cake versus how we cut it up, we're very, very bad at across historic governments. Anyone that's kind of ever done any work with the Whitehall department and the kind of nature of red tape and bureaucracy, I'll take homelessness as an example. We had the Homelessness Reduction Act, which had cross-party support. It introduced more money to local authorities to address homelessness, but actually, there were improvements across the country. The barriers of making sure someone had an address where they could effectively make a claim from, which obviously you don't have if you're homeless, the logistical barrier of that, trying to manage homelessness where there are heavy pockets in some areas in comparison to far less in other areas, and enabling local authorities to do that, didn't touch it. Those issues are more about not necessarily the money, but the money is critical. It's about the logistics of fixing the problem. We're lucky that there is a program called Making Every Adult Matter. It's called MEAM. It's being rolled out in some areas, and it's a much more targeted solution that's very locality focused on tackling homelessness. So if you haven't heard of that, please Google it afterwards, MEAM. I think it's an effective solution. But that's more about the cake and how we cut it, not just the size of the cake overall.
Excellent. Rosie, a quick line on the cake.
So 2 points on the cake. One is that Labour's plan for the cake is long-term investment, so creating the conditions to bake the cake and help the cake rise. So there's more cake for future generations. People have been, people have been talking about borrowing from future generations. That's not what you're doing when you're investing in education and when you're investing in solving the climate crisis. So we're rising the cake. And then, yes, absolutely, we should be sharing the cake more equitably. And that's why we're proposing a small increase in tax on the top 5% of earners and on profitable businesses, because we all benefit from public services and we all benefit from our public infrastructure. And those who are at the top of society and have been lucky to get to that position to earn lots have benefited the most, because they've benefited from being able to go through our education system, from being able to employ people. And we're all interconnected, and it is fair that those who earn a bit more pay a bit more in order to create a society that we can all be proud to live in.
Allison, so remember, we're on the cake. Is the problem in the UK that the cake isn't big enough, that we need to make the cake bigger, or that we need to stop slicing it? And then no more talk of cakes.
I love cake. I would have it morning, noon, and night. But there is only so much money, and when we keep rising taxes, remember in the 70s when they went up to 98%, all that means is people leave and then we lose out. So there's a case for responsible taxation, but also a case for dividing the cake up differently. For example, saving the £100 billion on HS2 and investing in northern infrastructures there. And so, yes, both are true, but definitely dividing the cake up. And we see where government have wasted money. And when it's £100 billion, then there's a lot of people who could be treated more fairly with that amount of money.
Thank you. Right, I think we're going to move on to the question of, seeing as how are we doing for time? If we move on to the question of public services, so have we got a question on that? Yes, gentleman there.
So I've written out my question so I don't waste any of my words. I didn't want to waste any of your time either.
Don't worry.
So, I don't know whether you would agree with me, but I believe that an ethic of hospitality towards strangers is essential for a free and open society. However, if you walk down the street in Oxford and notice the people sleeping in shop doorways, would you not conclude that Oxford is not a hospitable place for those who have no home? If you listen to the news of thousands of migrants drowning in the Mediterranean Sea and in the English Channel, would you not conclude that neither Britain nor Europe are hospitable places for those fleeing war and persecution? And if you consider the abortion laws in this country, does it not seem that we are inhospitable even towards our own children, and especially towards those with disabilities? In this country, a substantial risk of a child being born with a serious physical or mental handicap is sufficient to make an abortion legal up until the moment of birth. Perhaps this is an attempt to get rid of people like me before we can protest. I have a serious congenital handicap. Here I am, I have a vote in this constituency, and I wish to protest against all these manifestations of deadly inhospitality. So which of you should I vote for?
Thank you. I mean, if it's not on public services, but it's it's a very direct question, so let's take it out of sequence, as it were. Yeah, let's do it that way around.
Thank you for that question. It's incredibly important. For 20 years, I volunteered as a patient advocate in this constituency, mostly around Oxford, but in surrounding villages as well. So I know the struggles that disabled people face every day. And getting back to the cake question, when we divide it more equitably, then we can help disabled.
Would you address the question of abortion law, please?
Well, the abortion law is it's awful for it to be legal right up until the moment of birth, of course. I don't think that anyone would disagree here at all. So that was something that's going to have to be debated in Parliament, and luckily there is a mechanism for debating that and bringing it in line with our regular law. It's appalling, but that is something that we can debate in Parliament and then adjust it so it's more ethical and moral. No, it's awful. It's absolutely appalling for a modern society, and we pride ourselves on our ethical stance and help at all levels of disabled children. So no, that's appalling, and we need to do something about that.
Rosie, I'm doing it in exhibition.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll answer, I think there were sort of 3 questions there. It was on abortion law, on homelessness, and on the refugee crisis as well. So I'll start with abortion. I absolutely support a woman's right to reproductive autonomy. Yeah. I think that's incredibly important, and I think it's a healthcare matter. It should be decriminalised, and women should have the right to control their bodies. And I think that reproductive autonomy also means access to IVF equitably. And I also think having true choice over what happens when you're pregnant also means that we give women the necessary support, whether that's in terms of, not having cruel policies like the 2-child benefit cap that's been forcing a lot of women to have unwanted abortions because the choice is poverty or an abortion, and in terms of adequately supporting people with disabled children as well. I think, enhance that choice, properly support families with good wages, with a functioning social security system that ensures that no child is in poverty and that nobody doesn't have the means or capacity, that we've got the support there in terms of the care system for those who have children with disabilities as well, but uphold women's right to control what happens to their bodies. On homelessness, it's an absolute travesty. I think it was over 800 people who died due to homelessness last year alone, and homelessness has increased by more than 150% since the coalition and the Tory government since 2010. So it's absolutely wrong that in a country as rich as ours we have homelessness, and Labour's going to invest in building 1 million new genuinely affordable homes, including a lot of social and council housing that will help to tackle that problem. And then on the refugee crisis, we need to be playing our part, and we need to be cooperating internationally with other countries in the European Union, and recognising that a lot of international situations that have come to that crisis point have had a part in the UK sort of meddling in international affairs in the past, and we need to step up as a rich country that's benefited from our history of behaving not always very well to the rest of the world, and we need to help those who are fleeing as refugees.
Thank you, Rosie. James.
The homelessness point I talked about in the previous question. It's an incredibly complex topic, but I think there are things we can do to be far more hospitable, as you were putting it. I think we live in a world where it's kind of almost unimaginable in the sense of the scale of the country's wealth, and yet we're in a position where many of us probably walking here tonight have seen somebody sleeping rough. And so I think in the sense of how we prioritise what we do, particularly with our local authorities, and how the Homelessness Reduction Act worked, and programmes like MEAM, I think they are an excellent step forwards. In regards to our international obligations, in regards to people fleeing violence and warfare and famine, I think this country has a proud history of being welcoming and accommodating. When I think about my own industry and some of the brilliant people who inspired me to get involved in technology, many of them were people that at some point in their lives fled a war-torn country or famine. And we benefit so much from being open and accommodating. And as much as you've heard my particular view on Brexit, if I'm lucky enough to be your MP, I would still be fighting for our country to be that open and tolerant country, because I think we benefit so much from it. On the third point in regards to abortion, the experiences that I have seen, and also from some of my loved ones in my family and their friends in the process that they've been through, I completely support a woman's autonomy in the sense of the decisions she makes in regards to her child. The element where you're alluding to in regards to, forgive me if I've got the medical terminology wrong, a fatal fetal abnormality.
A substantial risk of serious physical or medical handicap.
I think,
the doctor doesn't even have to be sure that it will happen.
and I think you're hitting the nail on the head in the sense of the difficulty of how can you enable a physician to come to a view as to what that particular definition should be. And in that sense, there we have a legal gap. And I'd imagine there are many people in the medical profession who would welcome further legal guidance in that respect. But I think the core of what you're asking me is, in a sense of ethics, how do I feel about a parent making that decision, and should they be empowered to make that decision? The law should be that those definitions are so critical should be there to make sure physicians have a right framework to make the most important decisions so they can inform the parent, particularly the mother, because I ultimately support their choice. I would take it, I'm not in the medical profession, I would be looking to the medical profession in the sense of what enables them to enable the parent to make the best choice.
Thank you, James. Layla.
Thank you. So, I think some of the points have been covered. On homelessness, of course, it's heartbreaking. And one of the campaigns that I've taken to Parliament off the back of actually Oxford University students, and I've learned in the course of this campaign that Rosie was one of them, brought to my attention the fact that there is this law, it's called the Vagrancy Act. It was enacted in 1824, and essentially it makes rough sleeping illegal in our country. And to the questioner's point about, what kind of country is this that allows that? Well, I just don't think it reflects our British values at all, and it should be scrapped. And one of my frustrations about this election being called so soon into the Parliament is we were getting somewhere, and the campaign was growing. It's in the Liberal Democrat and the Labour manifesto. Crisis, Shelter, and others are on board. We were making our case for the Home Office, and it's one of the reasons I'm itching to get back, because I think we were getting somewhere with it. On refugees, I just want to take a moment to celebrate the fact that Campsfield House in Kidlington, after years and years and years of campaigning, is now closed. And the reason why we must celebrate this is because one of the reasons why our detention estate is huge compared to many, many other countries is because in our country we allow indefinite detention. Indefinite. You don't even do that to criminals. It's extraordinary. And so that is one of the things that we should change. I think it's also an indictment on our country how few child refugees we have taken in, against all sorts of government legislation that says we should, and we must change this around. And I'm sorry, James, when you say that we have a long history of being welcoming, I say to you, hostile environment. And it has... And it's one of the things that I deal with in, day out, again, behind the scenes in my constituency office. But to your specific point, sir, I'm not going to pretend to understand the ins and outs of the law that you're asking me if I want to change. And I think that would be irresponsible. And I would welcome you to write to me, and we can have a surgery appointment, and let's talk about it, because I don't think that's right for me to make a snap judgment. But I do think that we must remember that in our United Kingdom, it's Parliament that had to intervene for Northern Ireland to have its law changed. And that was one where I'm afraid to say and it's still the case because the law hasn't quite got there yet, where if a baby was already dead inside a mother's body, she had to be forced to give birth to it, because even fatal fetal abnormality was not a reason to have an abortion. That was just wrong. It was cross-party, and I think it's one of the proudest things for me that I've done as an MP was to get rid of that draconian law in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Seeing as time is running on, I thought we should move on to local issues, and maybe if we could sort of take 2 questions at a time and just be as quick as you can. That gentleman has been very impatient. I would definitely do it. Don't worry. Just two quick questions on local issues, please. Is it on local issues?
It is. Oh, sorry. Now it's working.
It's definitely on.
Yes, they are definitely local issues. Okay. My context was to ask about lying in politics.
Well, I was going to do trust at the end.
Yeah, but the 2 local questions. One is that the NHS was improved by the US company In Health, which is linked to Kaiser Permanente in the States, and Jeremy Hunt, who has visited Kaiser Permanente many times. And the NHS is improved by taking over the Churchill PET scanner, a scanner I have been in, and boy, did I need it. And I'm 5 years clear of cancer now. The second one that is local is that science is safer and better with UK control. So let's get out of Euratom. Let's get out of the European Space Agency. They're nothing to do with us. I only spent the whole of my career working with both of them. It doesn't matter, does it? And the final point, get Brexit done.
Thank you. Right, anyone else on local issues? I haven't been over there at all. Sorry? So I can't... Well, what do you mean by an open question? Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, it would have to be for everybody. But I wanted to do local issues, yeah? Just while we're on this sort of little... Eric, yes, sir, you there?
I've had the opportunity to speak to the MP on 3 occasions, not necessarily Layla, but the preceding MP, regarding local issues.
Yeah.
On every occasion, I've had to fight to come to a surgery to get an appointment. And I sit here tonight, and it's not Layla, but just generally, I sit here tonight listening to people have difficulty articulating things to do with local points, the first question about Brexit, etc. I want to know, what are you going to do about the flooding that keeps on happening in the west side of Oxford, because the Environmental Agency have done nothing to do with the streams?
Got it.
Right? And how are you going to articulate our voice in Parliament and not just say the political view of your party?
Thank you very much. Okay, do you want to get through those? I mean, I know I meant to say to get through that quickly. Right, let's start at this end again. Allison, just in a sentence or 2, do you want to address any of those?
Flooding.
Yeah, flooding and the gentleman there as well.
It's difficult.
Everyone around me told me that they thought I was talking about being in favour of getting Brexit done, in favour of these. No, I was talking about lying. And these are all lies.
No, sorry, I understood you were being ironic, but... Right, okay.
No, I think we understood that, yes.
Yeah, go on.
So, yes, I think that we've seen politics move, especially now since Theresa May resigned, and now we have Boris Johnson. We've seen the ERG, who were champions of Brexit. No, this is answering your question. And then they toe the party line. So your question is very relevant. How do we get local issues heard in Parliament when MPs must toe the party line? And they do toe the party line. So that means a change in Parliament, and that means a change with the whip. Pardon? The flooding. Okay, so flooding.
Don't worry, we'll make sure everyone does the flooding.
Right. The flooding. You do realize that we are controlled over our dredging times of year. It's an EU directive. And when you let farmers, exactly, and look, ever since we've been following that, there's been more flooding. So when we look what happened in Somerset. But this is flooding. Can I finish my sentence? I'll finish my sentence, thank you. So, there are a lot of reasons for flooding, and dredging, of course, is one of them, because our rivers haven't been dredged.
Okay, We're perilously running out
Right.
of time. So
if
can
we
a
let our
last
farmers
sentence?
control this, we were doing a lot better, as they have now returned it to the farmers in Somerset, and flooding is non-existent there, especially in this weather.
Thanks. The gentleman there, will you mind if we take the view that you made your point, and because we're running out of time, that we do the flooding quickly? Is that okay? Okay. Yes.
I would just like to echo the gentleman's point about in-health, which has had a disastrous impact on NHS privatisation locally, and people have really seen the impact of that on terms of when they're getting their scans back, and like it's just not joined up, it's not working properly, and we need to end NHS privatisation. Yeah, and then on flooding, I think it's really important that we're making policy on the basis of evidence and talking to the experts in terms of the Environment Agency. So I want to work with them in order to talk to them about how we can best protect houses around Oxfordshire without damaging the environment, have a sort of long-term sustainable solution that's ensuring that there's less water coming in. But yeah, just taking the Environment Agency's lead rather than that being sort of overly politically led, with the kind of motivation of protecting houses in the long term.
Thank you, Rosie. James.
Now, a point on the health topic that was first raised. We have clinical commissioning groups, and we have health and wellbeing boards, which are the entities that kind of cross the spectrum between social care and healthcare. These entities should be empowered. They're the medical professionals who should be making the decisions in regards to where that budget is going. I would want them to be empowered to make the most effective decisions of where that money can go. Political interference either side, it should be those bodies that are making the decisions about how money is spent within the NHS. On the flooding point, the Environment Agency are, I'll be flippant, an enormous pain. You try and drag them to a local event and say, hey, you know what, justify your decision to these people. Do they do public consultations regularly enough? No, they're getting better when they're challenged. We have a similar issue down in Abingdon, and trying to get them to a husting, open up and do a consultation, justify the decisions they're making. Where they've made commitments to investment in before and then they move them back, we get a one-page press release. But it's not always just about the money, because even when the funding goes to the Environment Agency and they make a commitment about how they're going to spend it, they'll do some assessments and they'll say, okay, actually, we're not going to put it here, we're going to go and put it elsewhere, which we've happened. And in that sense, it's incredibly frustrating, because many residents go, well, I wasn't engaged in that process. Why are you putting it over there? Did they ask for it over there? Why aren't we looking at other solutions? The Environment Agency should be dramatically opened up, because I think that would be far more effective.
Thank you. Layla, on those two issues, yeah.
We're running out of time, so sort of whistle stop. In health, what a shambles. And Annalise Dodds and I, and in fact Victoria Prentice, have been fighting this for as soon as we found out about it. I've had meetings and meetings with NHS England. Basically, they messed up this procurement process, but it comes down to a section of the Health and Social Care Act called Section 75, which introduces essentially that marketisation within the NHS. It's one of the parts of the Health and Social Care Act that I think should just be gone completely. You shouldn't have to tender like that. It doesn't make sense at all. On Euratom, actually, it was the very first thing I said in the House, even before my maiden speech, because it was that morning, and I raised the question of Euratom. Other MPs came up to me and said, what's that? And Parliament just didn't understand the intricacies of Euratom. And the thing is, it's not just about the money. The government are now committed to funding Cullum and others. But it's not just about the money. It's also about that free movement of minds and scientists and people that I think we risk losing. And finally, on the point of flooding, yes, it is. Of course, it's about money. It's twofold, actually. It's quite interesting. And again, I've held public meetings about this time and time again with the Environment Agency. You need to allow them to do their job, but you need to give them the money and the resources to be able to do it. Their budgets have been cut. We need, I do believe that the Oxford Flood Alleviation Scheme needs to happen, and one of the reasons why the costs of that has gone up and other projects like the Abingdon Flooding Scheme and other smaller projects have gone is actually partly to do with the falling value of the pound as a result of the referendum. That's not my words, that's the words of the Environment Agency. So just as an aside, Brexit has had already consequences on that. And what we need to do is to properly fund the Environment Agency and spend money on flood resilience. And in our manifesto, we have £5 billion earmarked for exactly that.
Great. Right, now this is going to have to be the last question because, yeah, we will get, don't worry, I promised we would have the climate, and so who wants to ask the climate question? You going to ask a climate question? Yeah, absolutely.
All the parties have policies for reducing the amount of CO2 that is produced, but it's quite very likely that climate change, well, it's already started to happen, will happen in a much more serious way before we ever get a hold of this. There's going to be erratic climate all over the world and world food shortages. I haven't heard one suggestion of anything you're going to do to prepare for the climate change that will happen. For example, more food grown in greenhouses like the Dutch have got loads of. Nothing from any of you. Do you have any policies to give us food security when climate change happens to the extent that it will do?
Thank you for the question. Another declared interest. I know, Tim, we were at school together. So, I mean, to be fair, they hadn't been asked the question yet, but you've asked it. So, last question, last answers. Well, I can't remember which way around I did it. Oh, yes, Layla. Yeah, go on.
Right. Well, thank you for the question. And as I started by saying, I do think that this climate emergency really needs to be treated as an emergency, and it is an emergency. I understand from, and I'm a scientist, I did a physics degree, but I'm no climate scientist, but what I understand that the IPCC has said is that we've got until 2050, and we have to make sure that the world decarbonizes and we reach net zero by 2050. We can. That's the point, you know, we've got 10 years in order to do this, and we've got 10 years that we need to make sure that we stay away from that cliff edge. So when you say it will happen, we need to make sure that we at least meet those scientific assessments of what we need to do. The Liberal Democrat Manifesto does commit to 5 years before that, and we need to listen to the scientists. And frankly, if the scientists then say, well, actually, no, it's not 2050 that we as a country and as a world need to reach net zero, then we need to move faster. But I would ask you to look carefully at the manifestos. We have a huge section on this, and I can't say it in 3 minutes. But I would ask you to go and look, and there is a swathe of policies. It starts with investment in climate, in infrastructure. It means we need to decarbonize. We need to decarbonize our economy. We also need to do things like, you know, I think put carbon footprint labeling on everything that we buy. And to the purpose on food security, I think that actually is one of the measures that would help. But I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, and we need to listen to the experts, as unfashionable as that might be in politics right now.
James, thank you, Layla. We're about to head into extra time, so if everyone...
In direct response to the question, the replication of pre-existing farming and fisheries subsidies that are already available, we have under the European Union, the commitment to make sure that they are maintained so that we don't shift to an over-emphasis on international importation in regards to our foodstuffs. It's a direct response to your question in regards to food security. In regards to climate change on a broader point, because I know a lot of people want to hear more on that particular point, if I can broaden it very quickly.
Yeah,
Layla's talked about the IPCC's recommendation in regards to 2050. Putting that in legislation, which this government did, is the right thing to do, but it has to go faster. And in the sense of what we are doing as a single nation, we've got to be very, very aware that the big, big challenge is actually going to be internationally. In the sense of what we do here, we have to give it priority, but it also must be a priority in regards to our foreign policy. Because what is the point in the sense of us making all this achievement when we've got global entities like China and India who are essentially industrializing? If they industrialize in the same way that we did, we are never, ever going to achieve the targets that are set out by the IPCC for 2050. We will completely be blown out of the park. So that also has to be something how we think about international relations and how we trade with those other countries. If it's not, for all the best win in the world we ever achieve domestically, we will not end up with the solutions. Even all the subsidies that we're proposing will never be enough to mitigate that global impact.
Thank you, James. Rosie.
We absolutely can't let global food shortages happen. That's not something that is acceptable. We need to act now to fix the climate crisis. That's why Labour is promising to decarbonise by the 2030s, sooner if our investment in research and development means the technologies are there. The Lib Dems and the Tories are only promising to decarbonise by 2045. We've been told by scientists that we've got 12 years. We need to act now. Yeah. And we can do that while improving living standards and bringing about our green industrial revolution. And I'm just so excited about our climate policy. And we're at a point now where, if we elect a Labour government, we can act. We've got the plan to do what needs to be done, to take account for our carbon emissions produced abroad as well, to hold companies to account and ensure they can't trade on the London Stock Exchange if they're not taking responsibility for their emissions. And the alternative to that is getting another Conservative government that's just going to continue to neglect the climate crisis until it is too late, because it's almost too late. We can't let global food shortages happen. We need to act and decarbonise by the 2030s. And also, just on food insecurity, because you mentioned food insecurity coming, and we just already have widespread food insecurity in this country, which isn't an environmental consequence, it's a social consequence. We need a Labour government which will halve food bank use within a year and end it in 3 by reversing cruel benefit cuts.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Allison.
Thank you for that question. It's very important, but it's a broad question. What we need to do is bring food production back to our country. We need to. My grandparents were farmers. They benefited from the set-aside with the Common Agricultural Policy, so they're paid to not grow food, and that will change, and that will be great. We can have greenhouses, and the knock-on benefit that we'll get from this, I'm sure you all agree, less food miles. You know, maybe we buy tomatoes that were grown 10 miles away rather than in Holland or in Spain, where our tomatoes are coming from now. Isn't that wonderful? We don't ship our poor live animals abroad. We raise our own animals here, and so our animals are from local farms, and they're not coming from maybe even New Zealand, but better from Wales or in this country. And that is how we tackle the problem nationally. We grow our own food, we make sure we eat locally, we buy locally, we don't, the less time our food is spent on the road, the better it is for our environment, the better it is for our carbon emissions, the better it is globally.
Thank you, Allison. So I know these things are immensely frustrating. I'm sure you'd all love to have asked lots of questions. And the last topic was going to be trust in politicians, which I'm sure would have been an immensely kind of fun one, where there have been all sorts of kicking. But I think perhaps we can at least say that the politicians, aspiring politicians that we have on the podium with us this evening have done their best to answer the questions that are put their way. So Layla, James, Rosie and Allison, thank you very much. And most of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you.